to see this new product within Microsoft and see how to grow it and do some growth hacking over there. Currently, I'm working on the OneNote feed, which is our strategy to bring all your notes in one place. So we've partnered with Samsung because we know that everyone kind of takes notes on your default Samsung or Apple Notes device. And how do we bring those and your OneNote pages and your sticky notes all in one place? So it's been really cool to, be able to work across enterprise, consumer, the education market, and small and medium businesses. And then I think my fun fact got cut off, but it was that, oh, that's okay. I realized that I hiked over 100 miles in 2020. I live in Seattle. I'm in the Pacific Northwest. So that was kind of our go-to with everything being shut down, and got to see some really cool places.
That's a good fun fact.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start just by defining what we're talking about. So definition of a product spec, you might get different definitions depending on who you ask. So this is from Product Plan Glossary, it's pretty standard. So a product spec is an important product document that outlines key requirements for building a new feature, functionality, or product. Key requirements document. So like a blueprint, a product spec contains key information, target users, business needs, goals, and other essential details to help guide the team in building a successful product. So basically it is a document that outlines everything that the reader needs to know about this new product or feature that you're trying to build. And the reader could be your dev team, it could be other product managers, it could be leadership. So it's a pretty kind of global document that anyone who picks it up should be able to read it and understand it, regardless of what exactly they're doing in the project or the company. And it should, not be super technical, just answering key questions like, what are we building and why? And what should this new product achieve? So what are our goals and how do we measure it? So all of those things should be kind of clearly outlined in the document and give everybody an easy overview of what it is.
So I'll speak a little bit to why should we write a product spec, and I kind of teased this in the beginning, but with Microsoft being kind of this huge org, we've gone through a whole journey of writing like the 6 to 10 pagers, and then no one reads them, and it's just a lot of work, to trying to be super agile. And it's like, okay, let me just tell you what to code, and then nothing's written down. And now we're trying to get back into, okay, what do we really need to write down in a spec, and why should we even do it? So here's like kind of three things that I think are really important. And the first one I think is the most important. So driving an inclusive product planning experience. A lot of people kind of have the misconception that PMs are the ones that write specs, or PMs kind of tell engineers what to code. And I think that is incorrect. I think really it's about bringing engineers and designers and research in very early on and saying, what are all the things we need to think about? What is everything we need to whiteboard? And I almost co-write my spec with my engineers and designers. I'll definitely be the one that's able to speak to every single thing. Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure if there was a question. I'll definitely be the one that's able to speak to all the bullets, but really saying like, hey, design has this open question, engineering has this open question, and kind of bringing everyone in also allows you to have advocates when you're going in and telling people, here's what we wrote, and your engineers, designers, researchers are able to speak to it because they've been there from the start. The next one is just driving visibility of your product decisions. I love when someone asks, hey, what are you working on? And I can just say, read this and let me know if you have any questions. It saves so much time. It drives so much transparency across the org. And, if you're working on something that was worked on 3 years ago and you're picking it back up, just being able to say, what did we decide back then, and then being able to do that for future PMs. And then the last one is, just the components of the spec, but really just whiteboarding like, oh, what happens when there's an error? What happens if this fails? What happens in this edge case where a user does something that isn't our happy path, but we want to document and make sure we've thought through it. And it really saves you so much time going forward and saying, yep, we have thought of this and here's our solution for it. So really that opportunity to brainstorm everything that wouldn't originally come up.
Okay, so throughout the process today, we're actually going to work on sort of writing or drafting a spec together. So just to kind of introduce that scenario, we're going to pretend that we are product managers at a popular ride sharing app of your choice. And we're digging into the experience of riders rating their drivers. So this is probably something that most of you are familiar with. You've probably done it before. There is a team behind this concept, working on improving this experience. So it's kind of cool to use a real world thing as an example. And just to credit where credit is due, this example is adapted from Kenton Kivestu, who is an ex-Googler, who blogs on product management and stuff. So he was writing about what is a product requirements document, or a PDR or PRD. Yeah, that switched. Which is basically a product spec, but just a little bit deeper and a little more detail. So we're going to use some of that to guide us today as well. And we're going to break it down into several pieces. So depending on who you are, where you are, what company, what product, whatever, your product spec might have different sections or key, criteria. But this list is pretty common, give or take a couple things. So we wanted to run through it, that every product spec is going to have some kind of summary or rationale. Then it's going to list goals and success metrics. It'll probably touch on user personas, user stories, design, functional requirements. And that's what a lot of people think of when they think product spec, is they jump straight into thinking about functional requirements. But a full product spec has to kind of provide this context. Also milestones and questions. So we'll actually walk through each of those one by one and kind of talk through it with our example. And we should have a kind of a lot of time for open discussion, questions and answers at the end. Okay. So he's going to kick us off with, oh, I forgot this little quote was in here. I just like it. It's an Einstein quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. So that's kind of why I think like the structure of the product spec has so much of this information. It's all about the context, about setting up the problem before you get into what you think the solution is going to be. Okay, summary and rationale.
Yeah, so the number one question I always get when working with someone is, how is this going to impact the business and why are we even doing it, right? And so I think that is really important. Like, what is the problem that we're really trying to solve here for the user, for the business? And it's really helpful to kind of have both of those perspectives in mind. Why are we trying to do this? That kind of touches on the business case. How might we solve it? And then surprisingly, it's really important to actually say who's solving it, right? And this kind of also goes to, you might spec the feature as a PM, but someone else might be the one that executes it. And so just knowing like, oh, here's the people that core kind of worked on it to start off with, being able to go to them to ask questions. So let's kind of bring these questions to our case. So you can just, yeah. Okay, so what is the problem we're trying to solve? Not a lot of people are actually rating their drivers. And, based on user research we've done, it seems like it's because people don't really remember the ride. Like maybe they took the ride on Saturday and on Monday, they're like, what am I trying to rate over here? Why are we trying to solve it? So, again, this is that kind of two cases. From a user perspective, there's I'm going to trust the app if I see that, 4,000 people have rated, or 400 people have rated John as a really great driver. And I can say, okay, good, I feel comfortable getting into this car. So that's kind of the user case. And then from a business perspective, if users trust the app, they're using it more, there's higher retention, new users are feeling more comfortable to come in. So, that can drive some of the metrics that Laura's going to talk about. How might we solve it? So, if the problem is that users aren't able to remember, like, what ride is it really? Maybe we can add a little bit more detail to the prompt. So instead of just saying, rate your last drive, we say on Friday, or with John, or whatever. And then who's going to solve it? Just all of us together.
Awesome. And if, of course, it was a real, like team, you would actually list explicitly people's names, and like this person from design is going to be doing it. Like this dev team is going to be working on it. Getting really explicit on like who's involved. And there are even whole little frameworks around like just that section about the team, of like team members who are like DACI or RACI, or different models for like designating team members. That like DACI's like the DACI is decider, accountable, consulted and informed, I think something like that, right? So it's like you have to designate like not only who's involved, but what role are they in? So it can just be helpful to be super explicit there. I forgot there
Yeah.
was also this example, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll kind of read through this, but we touched on in the last slide. So if you can, just bringing in, data to say, here's why we're solving the problem, and pointing to research over there that, hey, it looks like a lot of writers are skipping their rating. They can't remember because they can't remember the driver that they're actually rating. And, I think the next one's kind of a good point of a lot of writers may not even see their driver face to face because they just kind of hop into the back. So how can we kind of prompt and jog their memory?
Yeah, and it's good for us to kind of point to the fact that this came up in user research so that it's clear that we're not just jumping to conclusions and assuming like the reason they're not rating is because they don't remember. We're being told by the users like, oh, I skipped it because I don't remember by the time I rate it. Cool. Okay, next up is goals and success metrics. So we really have to ask ourselves up front, how will we know if we solved the problem? What are our goals in solving this problem? And how do we know if we met them? And what specifically can we measure to make sure that we know whether or not we were successful? Also, how do we know if we failed? Like we are the opposite of successful, we actually made this worse. And so then we will take a look at rollback criteria. So like B actually like pointed out that we wanted to make sure we touched on rollback criteria because it's something that can be so often overlooked. And it's like, what if you push something out there and like things are going wrong or people hate it? Like at what point do you know like we are reeling that back in and we were better off before? So what are our goals? We want to increase riders rating drivers. We want to increase that. We're not necessarily increasing the rating, like we're not like improving things from 4 to 5 stars. We're just increasing how many times the riders are rating their drivers or how often. And then in terms of what can we measure, we can just measure the completed ratings, just how many ratings are completed. And if there was a decrease in rating completion, that might be a red flag that like maybe something we did is actually confusing the user or, something's not good. And so maybe we should think about undo. So getting really specific with your goals and success metrics is ideal because then you can very clearly say like, yes, we've hit this goal or no, we haven't. So an example of this one would be drive a 5% increase in riders rating drivers when faced with the new version of the ride completion rating screen. So you have to say, what will they do? Like what percentage will change? And when will they do it? It doesn't count if they don't see the new ride completion rating screen. And when you're setting up your goals and success metrics, this can be a fun time to think about A/B testing, which is putting a feature out to only a portion of your users and measuring that in comparison to the people with the existing version of the feature. So you can say, okay, these people have the existing completion screen, these people have the new ones. Over the course of the last month, we saw ratings go up 5% for people with the new screen and 1% people with the existing screen. So it's helpful to have that because like there are other things happening in the world, right? So if you just release this and next month like ratings go down, that's an indicator that maybe something was wrong with the feature, but also like maybe, like lockdown changes and people are taking less rides and so there are less, there's less data to base it on at all. Like, there are other factors. So A/B testing can kind of help you with that side-by-side comparison, looking at your goals. Next up, user personas.
Yeah, so it's always really good, just for your product to define like who are the different types of people that use my product. And so that kind of breaks down into user personas. Usually design and research will help with this, depending on the size of the company. PM might just have to identify it. So really answering like whose problem is it and who else might be involved in the situation. So for the case of a ride sharing app, the two main personas are riders and drivers. And in this case, we're solving for the riders specifically. We want rider ratings for drivers to go up. There could be a case where we say, we want just in general, like riders rating drivers and drivers rating drivers rating riders to go up. And maybe we design it differently, but in this case, we've kind of scoped it to the rider. So it's good to know, like, who am I catering to? Examples of like other personas in case people aren't familiar with them, on OneNote, for example, we have a huge education market. So there's students and teachers, there's independent workers. So just, the person that goes into work and uses the app. So really knowing like, okay, this time I'm catering to the student really helps me kind of helps me eliminate the questions that may come up of like, hey, this doesn't really work for this persona. And it's like, well, this feature is not really catering to that.
I love that. Yeah. And I feel like one of the fun things you can do as a product person coming into a new job or new like role is learning about their personas. I love that. Like if there's a good design department in place, they probably already have stuff written up. And sometimes they even have like a fake, picture of what this person might look like and like a backstory about what their life is like. And it's just like getting you in this sort of creative space to really think about the people that you're creating the solution for, which is fun. So again, usually design really owns that piece, but if you're at a startup or a really small company, it might be up to product to kind of tell that story. And so user personas kind of leads us into user stories. So that's, what do your personas want to do and why? Kind of, again, what problem are you solving for them? And user stories are usually in this format you may already be familiar with. As a blank, I want blank so that blank. So in this case, a user story might be, as a writer, I want to remember which ride I'm rating so that I can give accurate feedback. Like that's just a simple statement of what a writer might want related to this problem. There could be other, user stories along the lines of, as a writer, I want to know the rating of my driver so that I can feel safe getting into their car. Or as a driver, I want to see, my writer's ratings of me so that I can know how things are going from their perspective, so there could be a lot of user stories involved in any given feature or product. But it's nice to have that kind of consistent format that everyone on the team can use and recognize. And then sometimes you could get even a step further from user stories to get into larger user storytelling with your scenarios and use cases. So this is one from that same article that I wanted to bring up. It's Travis recently took a ride late on Friday evening after catching up with friends. He doesn't use the app again until next Wednesday during a busy work day, at which point he opens the app and sees the ride completion rating for the Friday evening ride. He can't remember when he last took a ride and doesn't recognize the driver. As a result, he presses the skip button rather than rating the driver. It's not new information. It's like the scenario we've already explained, but just putting it in a slightly different format of telling, a story about an individual and their experience can make people remember it a little bit more.
All right, so design is really interesting. I'm personally really passionate about designs and product specs. So I will say that like really the core meat of the spec, I would say, is really defining the business case, the metrics, and the functional requirements. But sometimes it is worth having designs in there. So I'll give some of my opinions and just what I've seen, and then Laura, feel free to jump in if you have other ones. Definitely, I really agree with this bullet on your designs don't need to be too specific. Actually, one of the principles I follow is when I'm writing my spec, it's all about what is the user flow and what is the problem I'm trying to solve so that it can be designed in any way. I see a question. Is this because you're focusing on an MVP to start and then iterate later? That's a good question. So the reason I have it that way is because my principle is the design could be whatever, like the design can change all the time, and it will change because different design languages come out. You want to simplify things, but the functionality should stay the same. So whether it's a radio button or a drop down or a swipe through, what the user is trying to accomplish should be accomplished regardless of what it looks like. And then the other thing, just from a tactical perspective, I notice a lot is people get hung up on designs if they're in a spec, and people will start giving a lot of feedback on like, why is it like this? Why is it like that? And really it's like, we're still figuring that out. So I like to link out to designs, because they're going to change. A lot of people have opinions and feedback on it. And that way, you know, there's one source of truth, like this Figma file or the sketch file is a source of truth for the design, and that may change. But, you know, my engineers aren't getting confused by going into my spec, seeing a design that's different from whatever has changed. So that really helps. And then I know there's a couple other bullets on here. Yeah, so, you know, having low fidelity mockups is always good. Like, here's roughly like the ribbon area where we want to introduce a new button, or here's roughly like what we think the mockup is going to look like, but we haven't fully decided if it's going to be 10 stars or 5 stars, or, you know, a swipe rating or the interaction of it. One thing I do like to have is a hero shot. So I just kind of describe that as like, what is one screenshot that helps people visualize what the feature is? Some people are super visual. So if you're talking about something they've never seen before, it's helpful for them to say, oh, here's the product, here's what I'm looking at, and then just kind of having them that kind of orient them. And then I love user flow diagrams. So just saying like, first a user is going to see this, they're going to have two options, and then they can click on option A, and then that's going to lead them to this decision point. I think, you know, that's a great way to say, here's my flow, and then linking out to here are the designs.
Yeah, such good points, because I'm on a project right now where the designs are constantly changing, and it's really helpful to not have like static copies of them in other documents. It just super confuses people. Oh, I just saw another interesting question in the chat, that do you think high fidelity mockups are necessary for the development team when it comes to build? I think it really depends on your dev team. I think it depends on the comfort level of the people on that team. I've definitely started dev on projects where designs are not final, but you know, that might mean that we're working a lot on the back end and like APIs and things, instead of focusing on the front end first. I think at some point, usually a high fidelity mockup is good to provide. But then again, I've also worked on really small teams where like the developers are like just throwing stuff together, and like we have no designer, and it's just, you know, we iterate on it as we go. So I think it totally depends on the team. I don't know if you
Yeah, I think,
opinion.
you know, yeah, the question I always ask my devs is like, what do you need to be unblocked? Because that's really the job of the PM, is to unblock your team. And, you know, if that is a high fidelity design, then I'll make sure to kind of get that happening. But, you know, for example, there's things that'll come up. Actually, I'm running into it right now on like, what is going to be the hover text to help the user understand? That can happen a little bit later, you know. What is the string? Like sometimes that string changes because the copyright team or legal will get involved, and you're like, okay, this has to change a little bit. So some devs teams do require high fidelity mockups. I think a lot of it can come later.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree, especially with copy changes. Those sometimes tweaks come down to the last minute. Oh, and here's an example, like as we said, of just having a quick visual for people to know what we're talking about. Like there's nothing really on this design, like this is the existing page, and it's just like circling, like we're gonna be changing stuff around here. You know, so even if you don't know what the change is gonna be, just reminding people like this is what it currently looks like when you're prompted to rate your driver, and we're gonna change this screen, which hopefully people would know what you're talking about in this example. But sometimes in like bigger like enterprise software, you'll hear a product manager starting to talk about their stuff, and it's like, I don't even know where that is in the product. Like, I don't even know exactly what you're talking about. So just having a screenshot with like the area circled to be like, I'm talking about this. When you go in here, this is where this lives, can be really helpful for people to keep track. Okay, and functional requirements. So this is the heart of the product spec. And like we said, this is what a lot of people immediately jump to and think about in, you know, assuming they're talking about a product spec. But it can be very simple. And honestly, I think the simpler, the better. Bullet points are encouraged. So in this example, this is a really like, you know, it's a pretty simple feature that we're talking about here. And in a lot of teams, you wouldn't really probably write a whole spec for a feature this size. But sometimes you might. And so the actual functional part of the document is going to be like this small little couple bullet points, and the rest of the document is all about like telling the user story, building the business case, all of that. But the actual functional requirements part of the document can be really small. It's just going to cover what's in scope, what are we trying to do, and hopefully it'll also mention what's out of scope, because that's just going to automatically answer people's questions of like, but can it also do this? Like, could it also do that? No, yes or no, it's in or out. And you might have some non-negotiables to say like, I don't really care exactly which way it goes in terms of in design. Is it going to be a radio or a drop down, blah, blah, but like I am firm that like this has to happen on the existing rating screen. Like we're not sending them to a new screen. We are changing the existing rating screen. Like you just like laying down the law on certain items. So for this example to say in scope, this would be like actually what I had written, for the functional requirement is add a new description on the rating page with a reminder of where and when the ride took place. That's what we want to do. We just want to add a description text with when and where the ride took place. That's our hypothesis, that if we remind the user, then they'll be like, oh yeah, that was a good ride, and they'll rate it. And we'll see based on the data if that's a good idea or not, but like that's all that this is. So I would provide maybe possible text like your ride on Friday evening from home to Los Arcos Fusion restaurant, like changing it from your ride with Lido to like your ride with this context would maybe provide people more information enough to rate it. And then I would probably note something along the lines of like use the same locations stored for the ride as displayed in the receipt. So just reminding whoever's reading this that like we already store these locations. We already have this, in our background. We display it in other places. So we are going to consistently use those same pieces of information. And then out of scope, I would want to note that we're not changing the 5-star rating system. Like that's staying the same. We're not changing notifications. So like maybe someone had a really, helpful idea that like maybe we should start sending push notifications to them during the ride to rate it prior or in addition to after the ride. Like that's cool. There's actually a separate hypothesis that I would maybe want to measure separately. So I'm not going to try to mess with that in this feature. No changes to the comments field, whether or not you want to add more detail, we're not worried about that. So just really reiterating to people exactly how small the slice is. And sometimes the slices are not going to be this small, but just trying to make it clear in kind of bullet point format what it is you're trying to do. And anyone can like, this isn't scary, like technical language. Like anyone should be able to like, if you can just succinctly communicate what you're trying to do and like write it in some bullet points, like that should be enough to get started. But sometimes if it is a much bigger project, you're going to want to break it down. So I'll pass that over to Bea.
Yeah, so Milestones is an interesting one. And, Laura and I talked before, and we will say that the one asterisk is you're not necessarily trying to include a timeline here. But if it is a project that's like a lot longer, like 6 months to a year, or, you've scoped out a lot of things, so you really have to iterate, I think that's where milestones can come in handy, saying that for V1 of the project, here's what we're trying to ship, here's the hypothesis, and for V2, here's, what we think is going to naturally come next. And so that's where I'll lean on milestones, and it's less about timelines and more about iteration of the product itself. And, it can be really nice, especially when people are like, oh, so are we never shipping this? Something that they think is like very integral to the product. And you're like, no, we are. If you look in the milestones, it's just in V2, right? So that kind of helps you answer those questions. And I think it's like definitely like, I just kind of want to make sure that we draw that distinction from timeline, because kind of going to the design principle we talked about earlier, timelines are going to change. I've been in situations where I'll write a spec for something and then it's bookshelf because we don't have funding or something else has come up. But, 3 months later, 6 months later, someone can pull it back and the spec is still exactly the same. So that's where that's really helpful. And then, just we wanted to call out that there are go-to-market plans. If it has been detailed, I like to, again, link to it from my spec that, hey, we have talked about this, we've addressed it, and there's a separate document over here. But again, it can just get, then sales and marketing and a lot of other things and questions get involved for a go-to-market plan that are a little separate from what the spec is scoped to. So it's good to link out to it, but some of those details should probably be in a separate document.
I love that. And that I feel like depending on who's reading the spec, I get a lot of questions more about the go-to-market plan than the actual product. It's like, oh, well, how is this going to be marketed? How are you going to, how is it going to affect our packaging and pricing? How are you going to train the salespeople? All of these like other really unrelated questions. That's like, that's not about the functionality. Those are like other business questions, which need to be answered, but like, we'll answer them over here. So just pointing in the right direction is helpful. Okay, and then it is really helpful to include, and this isn't like questions like, it's Q&A time for us now. It's questions should be part of the product spec. So including in FAQs, if the same questions keep coming up when you're talking about it to people, just start writing them down, adding them to the product spec so that they're easily referenced and easily, read the FAQs. You'll find the answer in the FAQs.
Mama?
Maddie, I think you're
Are you hungry? Are you hungry?
Amazing. Excellent. Maddie, if you can hear us, you might want to mute, or I don't think I can mute other people. So
it is a cute convo.
That was cute. Someone's hungry. It was adorable.
Yeah.
Okay. And then also be sure to write down questions that don't have answers yet. I feel like that's super helpful and something that can often get overlooked. And people will start assuming that there are answers to these questions, and you don't know what they're assuming the answers are. So that can be scary. So for instance, like, what color and size should the descriptor text be on the screen? And I might like CC design and say, this is really your area. Like, could you help us answer this question? Or how granular are the ride descriptors going to be? Like, are we just going to say Friday evening? If so, what if they went on 3 rides on Friday evening? Like, are we going to say like late Friday? So some of those kind of open questions that are still being thought through. And then if this feature doesn't go well, if we don't meet our goals, what are the next steps that we might consider? Do we roll it back, like with our rollback criteria? Do we then consider adding that push notification during the ride, as like a step 2? So just thinking about next steps and writing them down for people is helpful. And now it is actually our Q&A time. So I'm glad we didn't go too long with the kind of walking through the steps, because we wanted to have some time to actually talk about things that you are interested in hearing. So I'll actually maybe put this up just so you know that if you want to connect with me or V on LinkedIn, we are more than happy to. We enjoy connecting. And also potentially, I put my Twitter on there. V is not a very big Twitter person, that's fine. So yeah, we're happy to stay connected and message with us and let us know how it's going. And yeah, let's do some Q&A time. So, oh, good question on the recording. I don't know how those are handled. So thanks.
Hi,
yeah.
Melinda. Melinda with Lessons Up. And yes, this is recorded. We will be sending out the recording and also the slides from Laura and V. And everyone will also be invited to join our Slack community so that we can all continue the conversation there. Yeah, and I did see one question that I don't think we covered yet, but Anna had asked a very specific question above. My devs keep asking me to define and write product business logic, which to men looks quite complicated and technical. Should business logic have to be a part of the spec, and actually should the PM write it?
That's a really good question. I like that. V, do you have an, I could share, but.
Yeah, you can start.
I think, it's gonna depend on what people are expecting from the spec and who the audience is, but I would argue that if I'm understanding business logic the same way, which is like maybe getting into like deeper into the flows and the technicalities of how something's going to work, I would argue that's kind of beyond the spec. I want to keep like the spec at a high level that can just easily communicate to anybody reading it. What is it going to do? What are we trying to solve? How do we think we're going to solve it? Like in the most simple, of terms. But once you start digging into the business logic, which in, I don't know, my experience starts to maybe tie into the architecture, that can get a little hairy. And so in terms of should it be in the spec, I would lean towards a no. Maybe it's another one of those things where like the design or like the go-to-market plan, that's sort of a separate working document that you might link to in the spec. but try to keep the spec like a readable, couple 1 to 2 pages might be better. Then in terms of should the PM write it, that's another question. And I argue that in an ideal world, 3 people are like involved in writing everything: the product manager, the dev manager or dev team lead, and designer. Like all 3 of those voices should always, and maybe not in real time writing stuff together, but at least all 3 should have to be involved in collaborating on the solution, read the document and sign off on it before it's brought to leadership or presented in the meetings. So I don't really think PMs should write anything in isolation. And really neither should devs. So if they're the ones writing exclusively, trying to figure out and write all the business logic, that would not be ideal either. I'd say the best solutions come from collaboration.
Yeah, I'll just kind of piggybacking off of that. I definitely think it's up to the devs. Like that is their area of expertise, right? To make those architecture decisions. Again, assuming that that's what you're referring to when it comes to business logic. I'll give you an example of something I'm involved in right now. We're doing planning and our engineers are really approaching me and they're like, here's the architecture we want to do. And my feedback to them is that's your decision. And here's everything that I need to happen in the next 6 months or a year, right? So that's capture scenarios for notes, that's search scenarios for notes. And if you believe that this architecture will enable that, then by all means, like I'm down for it. I will have an opinion on it. I do want to hear the pros and cons of it. But at the end of the day, it is your decision. And for me, it's like if you say, no, like you can't edit a note if we use this architecture, that's a red flag. And that's when I'll say, okay, well then that's not meeting my requirements.
That's super helpful. Did anyone have any other questions on that area as far as business logic or that specific question? Anna, was there anything more you wanted to hear over there? Let's see, we have a new message. Oh, great insight. People are thanking you.
Laura, not a question as such, but thank you very much for this. If you can go back one slide, I wanted to take a quick screenshot of that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh,
where
yeah,
you have
this quote.
Not that, where you have everything. Yes,
Yeah?
this one. Yep, right. Thank you.
I do like that quote from Michelle. And I saw in the chat somewhere, where did it go?
Yeah, we've got a couple new questions. There's how do you communicate all technical bits to the devs on their doc?
Yes, and I think that probably ties in also kind of to that bottom question of where does the spec live? It is outside of where you're tracking work, like in Jira. So yeah, I would say in terms of breaking things down to the devs, I would do that in Jira or in Rally or a similar product management software where you're breaking it down into really, really smaller pieces, tickets, and then estimating them. And then they take that and run with it. And you usually track those tickets across, a Kanban board or a sprint board or something like that. I do think that's beyond the scope of the initial spec document. But again, your spec could link to that level of detail, depending on who's reading the spec and who the spec is for. You might want to provide that link or you might not, because then people are going to start digging around in your project and seeing, your progress on your board and which developer is working on each thing. And this developer seems slower. And it's like, you know what, this is my project and you can just trust me to run it. And so maybe you don't need that level of detail in the product spec. So I would usually have some kind of spec that is more outward facing towards other stakeholders in the company and leadership to know what we're working on, and then really get into the weeds with my developers in Jira. But along the same lines, I feel like the principle still holds true that ideally the developers should definitely have access to the spec. And so anything that, any of the user stories or scenarios or kind of meaty and success metrics and things like that, they should definitely be aware of. And then when it comes to getting a level farther in detail, I think the same rules still apply in terms of keeping it as short and as simple and basic language. And I prefer bullet point format as possible. My Jira tickets, everyone kind of has their own, their own structure, but the Jira ticket is almost like a mini spec for me. And in mine, and everyone does this differently, but in mine, I usually have 4 sections. I have description, which is my like bullet points of like, here's what we're trying to do, just like maybe 3 bullet points. Design, which will usually link out to, you know, the working design, you know, Adobe or whatever that the designer has. Or if it's something really simple, then like maybe it's, you know, just a screenshot with an arrow of like insert text here or something like that. And then dev notes, which usually my dev manager will fill in to be like, make sure that this, you know, speaks to this API or whatever stuff that's like a little over my head. And I'm like, that's not, I mean, yeah, good to have that written down for the developer, not really part of the feature, like not part of the description, but that's your area to fill in what you will. And then we have an area for open questions. So calling out again, like, we're not yet sure how this is going to play with the mobile version or something. And so that's kind of just like a mini spec inside of every ticket. And that's how I organize it, but different people do it differently. I would say definitely having a separate place for like a public facing version of the spec versus the like, I'm in the weeds working with my dev team to get this done version of the technical details would be good to kind of have them broken out.
Yeah, I also love Slack and Teams channels as a home. I use Teams, so let me know if this doesn't apply to Slack, but I can pin files in Teams channels saying like, hey, here's my working group, here's where we post all of our updates. And so here's one of the tabs that's like our files tab, and that's where my spec lives. So I can just kind of point people like, if you want to see updates on the project, if you want to see what conversations we're having about it, I love that as just like a transparent way of my spec is here, my dashboard's here, and that answers a lot of questions usually.
Yeah, I like that too, the interface where you're already communicating about things. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, super helpful. We had a few more questions come through. What would the process look like with these documents mentioned? Would the product spec be the first document you create and share when you're working on a new feature? And then and you would meet with your designers and devs after sharing and communicating the specs with them? What is the follow-up with your team after sharing the specs?
Yeah, I can take this one. So I would say a spec's not always the first document. I would say a spec is once you already have buy-in that this is something we want to pursue. I would say one-pagers, at least, you know, I'm speaking for Microsoft. We tend to have a lot of one-pagers, right? Like make your case for why we should ship this at all. And so that definitely like goes into the summary and rationale. But that comes first, just saying like, are we even going to do this? And then once we're like, okay, we're going to have engineers, designers, because the spec does take some effort from everyone to write through. That's when you'll write the spec. And then different teams really have different processes. I like to think of like, you know, the IC engineers and designers that will work on your spec, consider their managers, so the engineering manager, design manager, or leads, to be the ones that kind of sign off on it. So I definitely tend to have a more formal process for getting it signed off on, but sometimes it can be more ambiguous. You know, sometimes people way up there are like, oh, I'm really invested in this feature, and so I want to give feedback and talk about it, and that's a great way. Some people just circulate it and they're like, add comments and I'll address them. So it can really vary.
Nice. Okay, we have a couple more that came through. Do you also add dependencies of work with other teams in the PRD?
I love that. Yes, that was someone made a comment about dependencies up further in the chat, and that's what I was looking back for, just to call out. Yeah, that's hugely helpful because sometimes it can even be a non-starter. Like we can't even do this project until these people are done, you know, refactoring this data framework or something. So that could maybe fit into, I mean, definitely call it out up front, you know, so like, we're not starting on this until this other thing is done. But maybe, you know, if you have a milestones view of like things iterated or broken down, I would, you know, maybe include that as the first milestone, even if it's not your team actually doing that work, just saying like, this is kind of the starting point at which we will be able to start exploring this project. Which can get messy. There can be multiple dependencies, you know, it can be a little bit of a headache. So yeah, definitely including that kind of information in the spec, I think would be helpful.
Nice. In your experiences, how long does it take to prepare a PRD before sharing it out with stakeholders? What is usually the most time-consuming part?
I'd say I can probably knock them out in a week for me, the most time consuming part is sitting down with engineers to whiteboard, which is definitely a lot harder in a virtual setting. But for me, it's usually like 2 to 3, like 2 hour meetings where I'm like, okay, here's what I came up with. Here's my flow. And I literally say like, point out flaws in it, like tell me what's wrong, tell me what I didn't think of. And then they'll be like, okay, well, you didn't think of copy and paste. You didn't think, what if someone clicks undo? There's all these small things. And then I'm like, okay, cool. Like, let me go back, let me think through this, let me work with design, and then kind of another meeting on like, okay, now what have I not thought of, And it's really those meetings where we were able to flesh everything out.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel it kind of goes back to the question of like, is the product spec the first document? And like my thinking of like, what is the first document is like, for me, it's probably a whiteboard, or like we'll use Miro to be like a virtual, whiteboard, and just try to like brain dump, like map things out, like with the developers, with the design lead, and so usually like the first document is like a total mess, but because it's like a working brainstorm, but that can lead to the spec. So yeah, I think it depends on the complexity of the project that you're working on. Like the one that I'm on right now, I'm actually just gonna basically present the spec to leadership tomorrow. I'm doing it in PowerPoint format. So it's like one slide per like important, piece, instead of sending them a document to read, which you never know what happens with those. So like a live, meeting in which I go through the spec or the PowerPoint is usually kind of how I get sign off. But I've been working on this since like before the holidays, because it's just a little bit technically complex, and I wanted to get a lot of different people's input into how it would function across the company. Like I wanted people on this part of the engineering team to weigh in because they deal with the user service, but then I also wanted these people to weigh in because they deal with the permissions. And then I wanted like the corporate solutions engineers to weigh in, and then some of the salespeople. And like I wanted to get a lot of different people's inputs before I even tried to like confirm the functional requirements. Like that was all like, here's the problem we're trying to solve. I'm not sure how the functional requirements are going to work yet. Like, here's option A, B, C, D, like give me your feedback. And then it's like from there we came up with like option E, F, G, like, and so it kind of blew up before I could brain it all back in to be like, okay, this is how it's going to work. I validated it across the team, and now I can write my product spec saying it's going to work this way. And if you want to see all the other ways, I like have a slide in there to be like, we also explored, solutions XYZ. And if you want to learn about those, like here's a link to a working document that like has details on why we did or didn't move forward with different approaches. But like, I'm telling you, this is the approach we're going with, and, moving forward from there. I don't even know exactly where that question started. That just really got me thinking about this project. Sorry, brain dump on you.
Yeah, no, but I love that, because leadership will ask about other scenarios. And they will assume that not all of the options were thought through. And if it's just documented, it just makes that conversation go so well for you. Okay, I love it. There are so many questions. Let's see. How do you negotiate the dev trade-offs or the technical debt issues that need to be addressed for a feature to be released successfully? Also, the trade-offs accumulated over time can slow down the new features that need to be added to the MVP product release. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because I would say for me, there's two times. There's one where I know that there's going to be so many technical limitations that we need to identify those before I can even start my functional requirements. For example, like this platform won't be ready for a year, but this one can be in 3 months. So probably going to go with the one that's ready in 3 months. And then there's other times where I know that there's like a table stakes experience, and this is probably for smaller features, right? And so actually a PM mentor of mine always differentiated between scoping decisions and trade-off decisions. So there's some features where I know that, this is the bare minimum of what should be in the user experience, and I will scope out certain things, but I've defined my MVP. And from there, when engineers say, well, we can't do this or we can't do that, that I consider to be a business and crew trade-off decision and not really scope. Like we have decided that we're going to take this out because of whatever reason, but really it should have been in the MVP. So Yeah, Laura, I'll let you build off of that.
I totally agree. And I think, again, like different teams and different companies handle it differently. One thing that I really like about the company I'm with now is they have built-in time in the year for technical debt. So like we run in 2-week sprints, the whole company, you know, it's like the engineering team is like 300 people. So like all, you know, or that includes product and design, I think, or something like that. And so like everyone's on the same 2-week schedule, and then we do like bigger releases like on like every other week or whatever. And so like everything's kind of synced up and in schedule with each other. And every quarter, one of those 2-week sprints is set aside for basically technical debt. So it's just like, we are not doing feature work. No one is building new stuff right now. Like it's on the calendar. Like features will be like, oh, we're almost done, but like, nope, we are stopping for this sprint to like drop it like it's hot and do technical debt work, and we will pick it back up in 2 weeks. And everyone's just on the same page about it, which is awesome. There have been times, which I don't love, but just to be brutally honest, like where we're like really close to having a feature done, and then like the 2-week cycle starts and it's like, okay, we're gonna finish the feature and we'll do our technical debt thing in 2 weeks from now. And like, okay, we're gonna go like a little bit off of the schedule, but just having that time built in, I think is hugely important, because if you don't, it's hard to make it happen. It's hard.
Yeah, I wish we had that time built in.
Yeah, that's amazing. Create company culture. Okay, let's see a few other questions.
I think there were a couple questions about, is a product requirement doc the same as a product spec? And I would say like loosely,
Great.
yes. Sometimes the product spec is maybe like a little bit leaner, and a product requirements can get a little longer, but basically, yes.
Okay, yeah. And then Vidya asked something that I'm trying, yeah. Oops, someone's joining at the last minute. Product dependencies come from product managers, and tech dependencies come from the tech lead. There are sometimes design dependencies. Oh, okay. I think someone was just expanding on dependencies. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, dependencies can come from all over. So I don't know if I'd say it's like one in particular person's job. I think it's a trio job of like product design and dev all need to understand what the dependencies might be and try to communicate them.
Yeah, there is a question there about who would be responsible to identify them. Okay, that was the answer to that, I see. Let's see. Can you share some resources on product specifications, templates, examples?
Here are a few. I should have had this up earlier. These are a few like specifically related to the stuff we've been talking about today. So product specs, I really like the product book. It's like a #1 bestseller on Amazon, but you can actually just get a free copy if you just go to the product school website and like give them your email address. So I feel like that one's like very quickly like readable and just very much like in common speak, you know, like a friend explaining to you how they do product. So I really like that one. And then these other articles are definitely touching on some of the stuff that we talked about. And then I think this isn't in there, but it just came back to me that I think there might be like spec templates that you can get like for Confluence or for Jira, like through those tools. Like there are like built-in templates for some of these things. So if you're using some of those tools already, you might have access.
Oh yeah, that's nice, built right into. The one on Almanac is a template as well, but then it lives on Almanac, so it wouldn't be as useful as a built-in spec in Jira. That's great. Yeah, so we are just at about time. There are so many thank yous coming through the chat about how helpful this was. So just V and Laura, this was absolutely fantastic. Everyone that's here today, you will all be invited to our Slack community. We can continue the conversation there. We have a lot more upskill sessions coming up, so I'll send you information, and we'll probably do a product Q&A during office hours at Lessons Up in the next week here or so. But yeah, big thank you, Laura and V.
Thanks for
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.